This is number 6 in our post-World War II theological landscape. And in the section I want to talk about Neo-Calvinism, particularly Piper and Keller, who I've talked about earlier, and then an article by Kevin DeYoung and the Gospel Coalition. And I want to look at the relationship of that because Kevin DeYoung in his article is very critical of C.S. Lewis's refusal to accept the penal theory of the atonement, and then he also critiques Lewis for his implicit inclusivism. I want to then touch on the postmodernism, particularly Brian McLaren, and the emergence of classicalism, of which McLaren will point to, but substantively doesn't go in that direction. So what we've had really in the last few years is, on the one hand, as I talked about previously, people like Piper and Keller are deeply, at one level, seemingly appreciative of C.S. Lewis, but they don't really understand Lewis, and this was brought up clearly in Keller's position that he didn't even think George MacDonald was a Christian, and he certainly didn't write as a Christian writer, whereas C.S. Lewis held MacDonald as his master, and I've briefly discussed that in a previous presentation. Now, people like Piper and Keller embody, in one sense, the elders, of which someone like a J.I. Packer is even the greater Abba of the tradition. So there is this line and lineage from Jim Packer through Piper, Keller, to Kevin DeYoung and the Gospel Coalition. So when I started this presentation, I was looking at the post-World War II attachment of evangelicals to the Calvinist tradition, and we can see this still being worked out today in the Gospel Coalition, of which Jim Packer is a living embodiment. Piper, Keller, Carson continued the tradition, and the Gospel Coalition, with its young bucks coming along, continues that heritage. Kevin DeYoung did an article in 2011 in which he positively, at one level, acknowledges the role C.S. Lewis has played in his own journey and in the journey of many people, but he raises two flags of concern. One is he's seriously concerned that C.S. Lewis does not hold to a penal theory of the atonement, and two, he's quite worried about what he sees as C.S. Lewis's inclusivism. Let me briefly touch on these 2 points. We do need to ask, as I have touched on in some of these previous discussions, why do certain forms of Christianity reduce the theories of the atonement to the penal theory? There are 6 views of the atonement. Why has this reductionism taken place? And many people who hold to these 6 different views of the atonement will use the Bible. They'll use the Fathers of the Church, arguing that the Fathers merely reflect, fill out, discuss further different views of why Christ came. What is going on in terms of a Calvinist read of the Bible that restricts, reduces, thins out the Christian tradition, and then turns it really into a new form of legalism? A person doesn't accept this view of the atonement, therefore their form of Christianity is somehow suspicious, or maybe they're not even Christian. C.S. Lewis starts from a position coming out of a faithful approach to the Bible as interpreted by the Fathers of the Church, that there is a variety of interpretations of the atonement, and by faith we accept the mystery, and we are not sure which is necessarily true, but all point to the greater mystery of divine love. Kevin DeYoung takes the position that unless one accepts a penal theory of the atonement, the understanding of Christianity is flawed, it's faulty, and perhaps heading down a heterodox, if not heretical, direction. So I think one question has to be asked: does in fact the Gospel Coalition truly understand Christianity, or who are the heretics in a discussion like this? The second thing would be his critique of what he sees as Lewis's inclusivism. And one could go from the penal theory of the atonement to Lewis's inclusivism. Someone like DeYoung and the Gospel Coalition will take the position that unless you accept a certain view of the atonement, therefore you're not going to be included in God's love. Well, this is very much a reducing of the spaciousness of God's grace and love to a very narrow agenda. And then Lewis seems to have an openness, in fact, to the natural abilities of humans in terms of their longings to know God, from other faith traditions, from a classical tradition, from an Indian tradition, the Tao that you get in the abolition of man. And so there is a wide spaciousness to Lewis, which you can certainly find seeing in St. Paul's, in the Romans, you find it in the Fathers of the Church. And so when you get to the Gospel Coalition, one should be very suspicious of the Phariseeism which emerges, or the Sadduceeism which emerges in these traditions, and how it thins out and distorts. And then you can see why, for example, things like postmodern or the emergent church is coming to be. The positive of the emergent postmodern tradition that you'll get in McLaren and many others, it's critiquing that Neo-Calvinism of which de Jong, Keller, Piper, Packer come out of, and arguing surely there must be more to the faith than this narrow, dour approach to faith, a form of Puritanism. And so the strength of postmodern tradition, of which de Claren and others write about, is that their critique of Neo-Calvin, and this is where we get a divide really between the richness of the postmodern emergence, but the Neo-Calvinist thinning out of faith. Now, the third position here between Neo-Calvinism and emergent church is a return to the classical tradition. The classical tradition is critical of the evangelical and the Calvinist when it thins out the faith, as is the postmodern. Unlike the postmodern, the classical is much more deeply rooted in the patristic tradition, both theologically, mystically, ecclesially, and publicly. The postmodern tends to slip in the directions of anarchism and just furthers the fragmentation of the modern. And so when we come to the end of this series, at the present time we're looking at three big models or paradigms or worldviews before us. There is the attempt to redefine and protect and defend the modern. We get the postmodern critique of it, which there's a lot of legitimacy in it. And then there's the classical critique of both the modern and the postmodern. And in many ways, that sums up some of the big debates in the post-World War II theological landscape that are with us today. The modern, the Neo-Calvinist and others who defend that, the postmodern critique of it, and then the classical critique of the modern and the postmodern. And it's in this trialogue that the theological landscape, both within Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, and various forms of Protestantism, is taking place at the present time.